I am hopeful, and it's unfortunate that we had to reach this kind of crisis level of housing affordability to get that kind of momentum that we have in the region and certainly nationally as well. And a lot of cities are starting to think outside of the box and kind of think about transformational strategies and methods that they can deploy. So we have some cities that we could look to now to kind of glean some examples. Of course, Minneapolis is kind of leading that effort at this point, and we're learning a lot from there. So, and also I'm hopeful because finally we're talking across interdisciplinary kind of discussions. Like you said, transportation, environmental, housing
Healthcare.
used to always live in the housing department, but planning departments are also looking into this. Designers, architects, developers, health professionals.
Right.
So it's become an interdisciplinary kind of topic and something that all of us are tackling.
I think that's actually been one of the most interesting things to happen lately. I think people are looking not just housing, but a lot of issues as a public health problem.
Yes.
So we have unaffordable housing. It's associated with lower life expectancy in certain neighborhoods. So we're beginning to understand the determinants of health and think of it in those terms.
Yes, and if you look at, for example, life expectancy between Ward 3 and Ward 8 or Ward 7 east of the river, there's almost a 15-year gap.
Right.
And that's one of the social determinants of health. Where you live determines your health outcomes. So, of course, it's an environmental justice, it's a racial justice as well.
There are places in Northern Virginia along the Route 1 corridor where neighborhoods that are just across the highway from each other show those really disparate outcomes of life expectancy. And it starts with the housing that they live in and the level of health care that they have or education. And you do see that it is concentrated among populations of racial minorities. So it very much is a racial equity issue.
And you can find Arlington cases of 10, 11 years or so difference in life expectancy on neighborhoods just within Arlington, which is a fairly small, geographically very small community. And obviously that's bad, and it's a case nationally where we're seeing cases of life expectancy declining because of stresses and things.
Right.
But I even just think in personal terms, my own parents had a difference in their lives of about 10 years. And so I know what that meant. I know the grandchildren not met. I know the things that grandchildren did you don't live to see. So it just becomes a very personal issue, I think, that we need to focus on equity and expanding life expectancy for everybody, all the neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
Right.
And looking at how we got here, how did we end up with such large disparities? I did my master's in New York City, and I was doing this project in the South Bronx and learned that the South Bronx children had one of the highest rates of asthma hospitalization among the country. And you look at the land uses there and the infrastructure and kind of how it evolved over time. There is an environmental and a racial component to that as well, where African Americans kind of their communities were being ringed by industrial uses and,
toxic
highways that carry all these trucks and that sort of thing. And then these communities ended up, with the same thing, the health outcomes, health outcome disparities that they have today.
It's sometimes it's hard for communities if they don't see what can look different. They don't know what can look different. They won't advocate for or support. And I know, particularly when it's changes to density in a community, people are used to certain ways that we build.
Right.
And even in terms of the cost of construction being higher than it maybe needs to be because of the way we've gone about things, people kind of accept that. And it ends up driving up the cost of houses, but also the rental costs for different apartments and things. So I feel frustrated sometimes because it's hard to think of a way to really engage the community and advocate for that kind of change.
I think there are a couple things. I think the building industry in general has been pretty slow to adopt new technologies and new ways. We all know that builders like certainty, and they like to operate from a set of plans and certain conditions. And so when we talk about new technologies for building, maybe greener technologies, more sustainable technologies, or even smaller housing, different housing types. Oh, no, that's not, that's outside what we do. So it does take someone who is willing to be innovative and thoughtful and a risk taker. And I don't know that the institutions that support development, like insurance companies and banks, if they support the new ideas and the new technology. So I think there's a whole industrial or an industry change that needs to happen. It needs the architects and designers to come in and show the broader community really what the vision is and what we're talking about and what could be. Because if you just think about what we're doing now and you ask people to change, the vision of what we have now is not all that wonderful in terms of our housing types and the cost. And so I think it's, it is kind of a process of bringing along all the elements that are engaged in the built environment and thinking differently.
I think there's a perception out there that when we talk about density, we're talking about 10, 12-story multifamily buildings. Right. But there's also incremental density. We talk a lot about the missing middle now in terms of housing typologies. We're seeing a lot of multifamily buildings and then a lot of single family, but we're not seeing that middle 2 to 4 unit type of housing, triplexes and duplexes and fourplexes, which can fit, from a design perspective, architecturally, from the character of the building can fit within historically single-family neighborhoods, for example. So we could, like you're saying, kind of broaden our idea of what the development looks like. That's one thing. And then, of course, there are a lot of tools at our disposal that we can think of in terms of, flexibility in zoning, and then some of the regulations that we've had so far that just doesn't fit within our framework anymore. Parking minimums, for example, they have no place when you're building next to high capacity transit corridors. And that's a very large component of construction cost for multifamily buildings. So those are the kinds of things. Exactly. And you have to go, because we want to build kind of a pedestrian-friendly type of environment. So now there's a lot of requirements for underground parking. Right. And then when we're not using as many cars anymore, what are you going to do with all these structures that have cost hundreds and millions of
that are
dollars?
Expensive, right? Yeah, that expense in creating underground parking takes away from potential housing units that you could be developing.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I think there's a generational shift too. I think older generations are still wedded to our development patterns, but I do think younger generations are more accepting about looking at new ways of living. People have indicated that they want to be in more pedestrian-friendly and mixed-use environments. They want walkable communities. You can poll young people and even young families who say we're willing to trade space for location, convenience, parks, good schools, being in a walkable transit community. So I think over time, if the building industry can go through some innovation and as the next generations come up, hopefully we'll be able to implement changes more easily than the conversation right now.
And in Arlington's case, that should be an opportunity because we do have a very large number of young people who have moved here and are mostly renters, but they should be open to that. Sometimes I think the issue is, if you think about the advisor commissions and the community meetings and all that, they aren't necessarily engaged in that process.
No, right.
So it's hard to hear their voice if they won't show up for a meeting. But I do want to, so the industrial capabilities and the transformation there, it was about 10 years ago. I visited a community college in North Carolina, which had recently just become, the entire campus was LED LEED certified. And for them, the key was they were at a point where they needed to replace a lot of buildings. They were at a point where they were expanding. So in a short number of years, they were able to do new construction that was more environmentally sustainable. And what their experience was, they struggled to find contractors. But they were patient, and they worked with contractors, and they got them to realize, it's not really all that new. Sometimes it's just a little more paperwork. It's maybe it's a new thing here and there. So by putting out there some big budgets, and we're building 3 new buildings next year, that kind of thing. They're able to change that local industrial base, I think, pretty quickly, and by being patient with them.
To get the contractors they needed and the folks that they needed to do the work, knowing that there would be a lot of work coming in the future. Yeah.
So the contractor realized it's worth my time to figure this out.
To staff up it, right. Well, and I think again the public is demanding more green development. They, commercial offices, tenants want green development. People in housing want green development. So there's again, the market is moving in that direction. So that should give us hope.
Yes. What do you feel like the chances are for regional solutions to come up? Because a lot of the tools that each community uses to try to boost affordable housing are very much focused on that community. Is there scope here for not just thinking outside the box in terms of housing types and models and density and all that, but just out of the box in terms of governance structures? Is that should we be hopeful? I guess I'm wondering.
Yes, for sure. I think there are, and Michelle, you may know more about on the policy side in terms of like regional partnerships, but on the planning side and some of the policy too, like there are some things that we can agree on regionally that we need to do, and we can work together to do that. I know earlier I mentioned the Metropolitan Council of Governments, putting out as a region how much housing production needs to happen between now and 2040. And Montgomery County, DC, Arlington, Alexandria, they're all starting to look at, what is our part in this? How much do we need to produce to reach that goal? That's one part of it. I think when it comes to Virginia, it's a little tricky because of the Dillon rule. Arlington has a set of rules that Alexandria, Alexandria it might be different. So it's a little hard to work on a regional kind of perspective when it comes to implementing policies. When it comes to inclusionary zoning and that sort of thing, I think it becomes a little trickier.
It does become tricky. And, excuse me, even for the region, if we're talking the DMV, we've got 3 separate jurisdictions. But I think we can all agree on strategies and understand that each jurisdiction is going to implement them in their own way. So it is such a quantum leap, such an accomplishment, I think, that the Metro Washington Council of Governments agreed across 17 jurisdictions to adopt regional housing targets. That's just never been done before. Now the question is, how do we do that? And I think identifying a set of strategies, and they become very basic. I mean, each jurisdiction should do a needs assessment and understand what their housing needs are. Each jurisdiction should have some sort of local housing trust fund that can be used for new construction and to subsidize units for extremely low-income people. Each jurisdiction should have policies around preservation. So I think we can begin to lay out kind of a set of ground rules or strategies, and then they will be adopted accordingly. And when we get to things like inclusionary zoning, that's when it gets tricky, like places in Virginia, whether you're a city or a county or what kind of form of government you have because of the Dillon rule. So,
what COG put out, for example, prompted DC to come up with that, housing production goal of 36,000 units by 2025, for example, and then they allocated goals by what they call planning areas to make sure that housing is distributed equitably.
Right.
Because east of the river, we see a lot more supply than, west of Rock Creek Park, for example. So, not just as a city or as a region-wide goal, but also neighborhood goals, because, again, over time, historically, some neighborhoods have, shouldered the burden more than others, or have taken more than their fair share versus others. So, looking at, again, equity in housing distribution as well.
And I think in Northern Virginia, jurisdictions started by looking at their transit corridors and where their job centers were. And so everyone has said, let's make sure we have affordability in those areas along the R&B corridor and Columbia Pike, for instance, in Arlington and in Alexandria at the metro station. So I think the idea, I know that the Arlington Housing Plan speaks to the issue of kind of geographic diversity and being able to put housing in all sections of Arlington. Not every jurisdiction in Northern Virginia has, I think, advanced that far in their thinking. And then there's also the issue of we not only we want to underserve neighborhoods, we want to preserve them and invest in those neighborhoods as well. So it's not just an issue of providing affordability in high opportunity neighborhoods, which is important, but also investing in those underserved communities, because in the community work that I've done in Southern Fairfax County, those people very much want to live there. That's their home. It's where their children were born, their friends and their family are. And they don't want to be moved to another part of the county. They want county investments in their communities. So it's a both and.
That's true. That's true. Creating housing choice as well.
Yes.
There are definitely areas, despite what some people think, kind of a very superficial level, there are definitely areas, neighborhoods in our area that are very much multi-generational.
Yes.
The families have put down roots.
Yeah, that's true.
They want to sustain that.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
I guess I'm also wondering to what extent we can, different jurisdictions, typically will have a housing, you mentioned a housing trust fund. These things. And sometimes that, in terms of any given year, it depends on what's on the market. What are the possibilities to develop something that's going to be committed affordable? And I know that a lot of the developers, nonprofit and for-profit, definitely work across different jurisdictions, partly reflecting that. They're going for opportunity. The trust funds don't necessarily work that way. If the Arlington Trust Fund gets support one year, but the best opportunity is not in Arlington, let's say it's in Alexandria, we probably need to figure out some way for there to be some kind of a transfer or sharing, because if it's going to be a regional solution, it's going to be a regional contribution. So I don't know to what extent that's possible, but I think the governments could figure something out that they could share.
There's been talk of kind of regional housing funds, but they've never gone anywhere, because it's we do it in terms of metro and transportation. There's joint planning and sharing, but we have not been successful in doing it in housing, maybe because metro crosses jurisdictional lines and housing doesn't. But it's interesting, we have seen a lot of Northern Virginia developers migrate to the district because of the richness of their housing trust fund. So money does draw developers, especially of affordable housing, who really cannot do this without some sort of subsidy.
It takes a lot of different programs to fund these kinds of projects.
And so we need to feel confident that the money is, the developers are being drawn to where there's needs, not just where there's money. And I think fortunately almost every jurisdiction, even Loudoun County now has a fairly, $25 million, which is good from what they had in the past. And even Prince William, which does not have a housing trust fund, realizes that they need to do something. They have new political leadership there, so that's exciting. But I think almost every jurisdiction has some source, some local housing trust fund source. And of course now at the state level, Governor Northam has proposed a substantial increase in Virginia's state housing trust fund,
which is significant, and hopefully that will pass the General Assembly budget this year.
And you were both at the Housing Summit in Alexandria this
Yes.
weekend.
Yes.
I'm just curious, I unfortunately could not make it, but did you feel a lot of energy coming out of it? A lot of excitement? What wondering what the tenor was.
I think, yes, there was excitement. There is excitement that this is becoming a forefront kind of topic, and people, again, across disciplines are coming together to talk about how can we solve this. Everyone has different ideas and different ways to go about it, but at least we're starting that discussion, which I think is good. I mean, it included, developers. Again, developers here, they work in DC and Northern Virginia, and elected officials, public sector kind of employees as well. So it was good to kind of get everyone in the room and talk about, well, we're facing this. How do we talk about it, and how do we create the solutions? So that was good.
Yeah. I think it was exciting to see the enthusiasm of Mayor Wilson, who kicked it off. He was very enthusiastic. Yes. Of course, that's his personality. Yes. But he's really embraced this issue. And then at the end, the final session that included both the mayor and Christian Dorsey. Mm-hmm. So to seeing the collaboration of the two jurisdictions is also something that we haven't seen in Virginia. And that is very hopeful and encouraging, how they can work together. They already pointed out a few ways that they're working together on condominium issues and on tenant-landlord relations. So, I think that's what we need to do, kind of create some best practices that we can learn from each other and move this needle on housing. Yeah,
and there were a lot of case studies as well presented by whether it was developers or for-profit or nonprofit or even churches who are starting to look at their assets and say, we have all this land, how can we contribute to this?
Right.
So it was good to hear from them first, like how they went about creating that sort of partnership, getting the funding, and what they need to make this happen even more in the future. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was exciting as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, do you feel like a barrier, and some of the churches that have tried to coexist with affordable housing in their worship space? I know we have a case in Clarendon where that worked very effectively. Mm-hmm. Are there any barriers to maybe the financial industry not getting it? I'm wondering where the barriers are, or whether the barriers are more of a zoning question.
There's a zoning. Zoning is definitely part of it. Right. Community buy-in. They're used to seeing the church with kind of a lot of open space that's usually probably parking. And now they're saying they're putting a 5-6-story housing, and then it's hard to bring the community along, and of course it drags the process for such a long time that a church now has to face thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees to kind of get the project to move along, and it then takes 2-3 years before they're able to get approval and break ground. So I think these are some of the barriers that we need to look at, like how can we streamline these things a little more and create community consensus on the outset before a project by project start to happen, and we have to fight everyone, tooth and nail. So I think, neighborhood planning can play a big part of that, making sure that we have a plan that the community is kind of on page with, so that once projects happen, it's kind of expected.
Yeah, it's part of that change element, right?
Exactly.
As you say, I'm used to seeing a church here, and now someone's telling me they're going to build an apartment building here, and we're going to have all these people, and I'm not going to be able to, how am I going to get, So I think also many churches their land is owned by their council, a higher level. Right. So getting the, authority to either lease or sell that land can also take time. But I think you're right. The community concern about a change of use is probably one of the biggest barriers.
And they're motivated by a real understanding that this is part of their mission to serve the community.
They are.
So they're coming at it, I think, it fits very well with how they see
Their faith,
themselves.
yeah.
But it can be difficult.
Yeah, I've listened to a couple presentations. They talk about their discernment process of kind of going through what are the needs in our community, and always, being confronted with the housing crisis. So
Right.
many of them have come to this. Yes.
Right. And they often, like some of them, maybe they started off by offering a food pantry to
Exactly.
the community, and
That's
they get
right.
to speak with people who are directly facing those housing
Right.
challenges.
Yeah. Many of them are involved in kind of human services and safety net services. And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Right.
But that's another part of also zoning, planning, land use, I guess, that I'm excited about, which is co-location of uses. One of the things that people bring up a lot when you're talking about a large multifamily building coming to your neighborhood, school capacity, public amenities, what do? We don't have enough. And then, we're starting to see some of these co-location type of buildings, like fire stations with affordable housing on top, schools with housing on top, or offices. We don't have to have a 3-acre land to put a 1-story school on anymore.
Right.
They could be within kind of a taller apartment or office building or something like that, which is a more efficient use of the land, which is, as we know, is pretty scarce here. So I think I'm excited about that aspect too.
Before we got going on the program, we are talking about shipping containers.
Yes.
Yeah.
As a way to get
Yes.
through construction costs and lower them, and not just lower construction costs, but lower construction time.
Yes.
So that
Resources.
if you're a family and you're buying, if it's a single family model for that can be delivered and not take 6 months to construct.
Right.
It's not affected by
Right.
weather.
Right.
So you don't have to rent somewhere for 6 months. But just the bigger, more density ones that I think are even more interesting in terms of coming up with affordable housing in Arlington and Alexandria, and places nearby, where it's 25, 30 units, and it's created a lot less expensively.
So now our planning and zoning or our building codes or whatever have to make sure that those things are compatible. I mean, the building codes they can be a barrier. In the presentation on accessory dwelling units at the Alexandria Summit on Saturday, they talked about the requirement that these small units have fire sprinklers in them, and how expensive, prohibitively expensive, that can be. And the gentleman who was presenting said, if I was remodeling my home, I wouldn't have to put fire sprinklers in. But so yes, all these kind of code things that we need to look at. There's a whole kind of evolution or revolution in that industry that needs to take place. So.
I agree. I mean, we've had these zoning codes since the early 1900s in some cases, and they get updated incrementally, but still, like, some of them are from the 70s, and they just don't fit with the issues that we're facing today.
Right.
I think a lot of jurisdictions are moving away from kind of the Euclidean type zoning to more of a built form type, where you focus more on design principles and, again, walkability, sustainability, that sort of thing, rather than bulk and height and setback and lot coverage, that sort of thing.
Things that create the vision at the end of the day of the community that you want, that it is about walkability and not about how tall the building is or what the setback is. So, yeah.
I used to work more in international development, and so this was a while ago, but there was a great exhibit in DC put together. I think it was a design challenge they put out to college students dealing with post-disaster, Civil War refugee. How do you get housing to populations quickly and inexpensively? And so there must have been 15 or so models created from different visions, very much outside the box thinking. I think we probably need to do that. We need to add that to our housing summits and things. Let's get our high school students, who some of them are taking classes in architectural drawing, building some models and letting us see a vision of something that we have not seen before, and they can get conversations going, and we need to be it needs to look different.
That's right.
I think they did that after Katrina. There were many people who flocked to New Orleans to talk about how to deploy housing
Right.
quickly, efficiently, that could deal with flood waters and
Right.
sustainably. And so, no, unfortunately, the world has experienced more natural disasters and refugee migrations, and
Right.
so this is a huge need now of shelter
true. Yes.
Right.
for people.
Yes.
And those probably aren't the things that we would use in our communities here
No.
today, but new ideas and new ways of thinking and new technology would come out of it. So, yeah, it's an exciting time. There is an event that George Mason University is hosting with the DC architects that's coming up called Demystifying Density, and it's using design
Yeah.
to help people address
that's wonderful.
missing middle housing.
Yes.
All right.
It's at the end of February, I think.
Okay.
It's coming up, but I'm very
you must
excited
see
about it.
Yes.
Yeah, it's an all-day event, and it's probably meant for architects. It's got the
Right.
CLU credits, but I'm going to go anyway because
Yeah,
I
that
think
sounds great.
yeah, I think these are the kinds of I just personally think design is such an important element as we have these community conversations. So
Right.
Yeah.
I've been on different commissions and different things, and I often, sometimes I like to quote or make a reference to Orson Welles, who was a film director. He always wanted his film crews to be thinking of being very creative. So he would often tell his team that it was going to be a dream sequence, even when it wasn't.
oh,
Because he wanted them to think anything is possible. Let's do what we want to create a story. And I think we need to have that similar attitude. Let's do what we want to create a community.
Yeah. We have a very well-informed, I would say, community here in Northern Virginia and DC. They understand planning. They understand, a lot of the planning lingo. And so in a lot of meetings, I would see people asking, well, what's the FAR? What's the density? I'm like, well, here's the FAR, but let's look at, examples.
Right.
And you pull up a 1970s high-rise, sitting in the middle of a parking lot, and what would seem as a high-dense apartment building with ground floor retail and that sort of thing lining the entire block, and you would say, those two are exactly the same density. Which
right.
one looks better to you?
Right.
And so I think it's more important to start with, here are some examples. Which ones do you like? And which ones do you think fits in your community? And what they pick is very different from what they would pick otherwise in terms of numbers and density and FAR and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
I agree that design is a very
those
important
illustrators at our community meetings, I think, are really key. They're
Right.
not inexpensive to bring to a meeting, but I think maybe the time saved in getting approvals might
Just to pay for them a few
justify.
times,
Yeah.
complaint.